Hi, everyone. Hello, class. Hello, guests. I'm Professor Alex Uhas, Professor of Media Studies at Pitzer College, and I am a co-facilitator of Doc 2013 with Professor Ann Balsamo. To my farthest right in the beautiful blue shirt, we have Dr. Sharon Irish, who is a project coordinator in the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. She's an art and architectural historian interested in ways to activate history and the arts in the present day for a variety of people. And then here is Professor Radhika Gajla, who's a professor in the School of Media and Communication Studies and American Cultural Studies at Bowling Green State University. Some of her research and teaching interests include digital media, globalization, gender, race, and technology, South Asian diasporas, critical development studies, affect and placement in digital space, transnational labor, and women in NGOs. Thank you so much for joining us. So the first question I'd like to ask you guys is that I'd like you to each define your place, which is the subject for today, in relationship to feminism and technology. Who would like to go first?
Well, I guess I'll go first. Place has a pretty practical, obvious aspect to it, and that is a built environment, but also in the way that Doreen Massey talks about it as a place as always in process. So any building, of course, is going to change over time and change with the users, change with people walking in, walking out. And plus, Henri Lefebvre, who's kind of one of the theorists of the production of space, talks about, he links the political economy of space to place. And so I think for me as an architectural historian, it's always very important to remember the political aspects of place. In terms of feminism, the place-based part of technology and feminism is the political and the technological aspect of a building, but also the feminist part is its sensory and aesthetic and environmental and cultural and historical and memory part of it, so that it is a complex, layered aspect or concept.
Before you answer the question, one of the things that I think feminist geographers talk about, and perhaps feminist architectural historians as well, is gendered, how space or place is gendered, and that we would enter feminist analysis through that kind of thinking, or how it's raced as
Yes.
well. Could you talk a little bit about that before Radhika answers the first question?
Sure. One of my favorite books is George Lipsitz's How Racism Takes Place. And for me, the political aspect of place is that there are places that are safe or not safe, welcoming or not welcoming to women, to trans people, to queer people, to people of color, all kinds of often labeled non-normative people. And so the gendered aspects of place have always been of concern. My first real book on Cass Gilbert, he was a skyscraper architect, and of course there were many women who worked in skyscrapers, but often the bathrooms were every other floor for women. So there was already kind of built into the architecture a sense of not being welcome in that space.
So Professor Gajla, can you answer the first question and then perhaps also the second question? So define place in relationship to feminism and technology in your own thinking. And then this question is how is space gendered? How is space raced? How can we think about it in those terms which are so important to feminist scholarship?
I have to say, Sharon and I probably are thinking similarly, and it's amazing how similar we're thinking just based on discussing the articles. But my entry into thinking about place is very personal. Like Sharon, I'm also a product of a kind of a mobile family where my body has been in various countries and various contexts. And so what I've had to do as a communication, new media researcher and a communication teacher is to come back always to the embodied an interpersonal aspect of place and how we construct, how we build through our relationality particular places and how we carry this with us. Doreen Massey, I discovered her and she was like resonating with me, but I also struggled with how some people would struggle with her work. For me, her work was so evident when she talked about the process, about places ever shifting, about practices in space. But some people seem to think that Doreen Massey is purely discursive. But for me, it's very concrete. She's not talking about the imaginary. She's talking about the fact that you can be in one place at one time and come back to the same physical place, so to speak, and find it not be that place. And we know this is increasingly happening as we find buildings disappear and other buildings reappear. And this is a condition, has been a condition in modernity, in modernizing, developing country contexts. A lot of the places that I grew up in, because my father was in the United Nations, and since my age 3, I've been traveling, living in Africa and in Southeast Asia, Bangkok and Indonesia, so to speak. And of course, India. And every time if you return back to a place, it's it feels like it could be the same. It's not. You're so decentered and so destabilized when you return after even a few weeks sometimes. And so the way in which you maintain a place of security that most diasporic communities are good at is it takes you back to thinking about Fiddler on the Roof and Reb Tevye, right? Tradition. Well, tradition is a set of practices that are constantly shifting. That's what people miss when they talk about tradition as if it's frozen. So I look at practices and rebuilding of tradition in that way. And then you take me to places online. I'm able to build my temples online. I'm able to build different practices of interaction online. I'm able to build material and real practices online. So I would say that a central question for me is where and how are I placed? And so the important things for me are place, labor. We labor. We were there because we labor for capital. We labor to survive. You are in school because you want to get some form of access to some kind of livelihood. The body moves in places, mobility, placement, practice, and then you connect with memory, nostalgia, and spatiotemporal compression, which is the most problematic thing in terms of how we view the static images or the problematics that several of you brought up, even in relation to Suzanne Lacey's quilt, how it's viewed later on, or in relation to how we might disrupt ideas of race online, yet when they remain as static archives, they reproduce the same. And I might bring up some images later that about digital natives that while problematizing the idea of who a digital native is, might also then reinstate, as my co-author recently pointed out, reinstate the same binaries. But in terms of Dr. Juhas's question of place and the physicality and feminism, how you're placed is in terms of is also for me as a transnational feminist, post-colonial feminist, or whatever you want to call me, the whole idea of private-public binary being assumed as oppressive in a particular way is also problematic, because architecture of even perhaps private spaces, of women's spaces, which may be considered in a certain kind of a liberal feminist or Western feminist way as being oppressive to women, could actually be considered to have been empowering in certain ways. We bond in places where we can kind of collect our wisdom and then build up a response. So we're always developing responses physically to the world. How you present yourself is your placement.
Thank you, guys. And I guess one of the things I want to sort of save for later and perhaps for the Q&A is more conversation about what safe space is and how there is not one kind of safe space. And that's a feminist conversation that has a long legacy, an important legacy. So let's sort of sidebar that perhaps. But also this notion that you begin to talk about all human beings having agency themselves to shape space. It's not just that space acts on you, it's that you are co-producing space with agency, and some more simplistic thinking perhaps imagines that we are produced by space and that we don't co-produce space. And so perhaps we can think about that as we move forward as well. But however, our next question, can you tell us a little bit, because I think my students have really enjoyed hearing the professors they read talk about this, your own intellectual path, how you got to asking these questions and why they're important to you.
Sure. Really, I think this quote that is up there from Doreen Massey maybe speaks to how I came to the work of Suzanne Lacy, was the sense that space is a performative space. And so even though there's no same place that we go to again and again, we come to a place in encounter or in relationship either to the place or to people in the place. And so I was really interested in that user, the person who comes to a building, and that was relevant in my studies in architectural history, which were fairly traditional with my book on Cass Gilbert. But one of the reasons that Cass Gilbert connected me to Suzanne Lacy was because his designs are very scenographic. They're very theatrical. So the places that he created were exuberant places. And Suzanne Lacy's work was very much about framing performance with physical spaces. So she would go around cities and look at the best place to create her performances. And so that was my interest in architectural history, has always been kind of relational and performative. And then as a historian of technology, which is kind of part of building technology that I do, John Stoudemire, who was an important theorist and also editor of Technology and Culture for a long time, had this idea of different constituencies that technology affects. And so he outlines three: the design constituencies, people who are mostly empowered to create these technologies, and then maintenance constituencies, which are a very diverse group of people who have some kind of involvement in the technology, whether it's, designing a skyscraper or whatever. But the part of the process that interested me almost as much as anything were the impact constituencies. And he talks about the ways in which people are either impacted by a technology because they're paying for it but they're not benefiting from it, or they are people who lose actually because of the design of the technology. So if your neighborhood is divided by a freeway through it, you are not only not gaining from it, but you're losing the sense of your neighborhood or your community. So that idea of impact constituencies was important to me, to remember the complexity of space. And of course, after that freeway goes through and we come along 20 years later, we don't even know about the neighborhood that was there unless somebody is helping us extract or bring up those memories. So it's kind of an archaeological project, to all of which can be very mediated.
Just a little background. What brought you to ask these questions? What is your intellectual legacy that brought you here?
Okay. Well, Um, well, if you want to ask me my intellectual legacy that brought me to academia, I have none. I was a stay-at-home mother for 7 years or 8 years, and I what I always liked to do since I was a teenager is write. And I kind of self-trained. I took a kind of several correspondence courses even before I was married and became a mother. To do, excuse me if I'm talking like this because, excuse me. Yeah. So I kind of self-trained to be a freelance writer. Sorry about that. Um, So those are the two things that define me. The fact that I do not come with any legacy. And in that sense, I guess, several people, I might seem to be a very help and self-centered, individualistic person who will not compromise. That's the core of me. Where not very many people see that because I'm a very collaborative person. So the other thing that defines me is the fact that I've always had to build community for myself. And so I recognize where people need community. So in that sense, I'm always struggling through the space of being a very, very interestingly private person who has learned through a great deal of shyness to be an extrovert appearing person, because that's the way you get access to community, but also how to manage to work with other people without having to fully compromise who I am. And who I am is always shifting. So that's the core of how I would get into academia, because academia allows me to do some of these things in a way that perhaps other places may or may not. So that's how I got into academia. But how did I get into researching online place? Well, basically, I was at home in 1990s, in roundabout when Usenet, Chat, IRBs, Listprocs, these kind of were accessible to us. I know the internet has existed for much before, but for me, the internet came into my life in the 1990s when I came back to school, when I started doing my master's with a 7, 8 year old at home. Um, having a child at home and being a spouse of a graduate student limits you in different ways, but also opens up your space in different ways. So I had to be physically around and also try to save money. So the internet gave me the way to connect to people. So I was searching for community, basically, through the internet. Whether I found it or not, I found some communities, and I realized that if you want to be part of a community, you have to work to be in the community. So what I did then was I joined this South Asian women's community, and I would post to it my so-called poetry and other stuff. And then I had a moment where which I think is explained in the Cyber Selves book, which again goes back to the fact that you think you're part of the community, and the community kind of turns back, and the community is not a whole. There are many people from that community who are my close friends. So but as a discursive whole turns back and says, maybe you don't belong here. So this is nothing to do with whether your body is physically there or not. So your body is there and not there. So then I said, okay, guess what? I'm going to build something that I belong to, and I worked towards making several Listprocs. I called it the Third World Women Listproc, and then I managed the Postcolonial Studies Listproc, and then I set up another South Asian Cyborgs Listproc, and then I started to build all kinds of web presences because HTML was new then, and it's unlike with building apps and other things nowadays and Flash, it wasn't a high level of literacy required to build your online presence. So it was very individually liberating, but I was fully aware of the issues of access because in those days, access wasn't as easy as it is worldwide now. There are other problems of inequality, but access is not that much of it. It's a problem some places, but not in the way it was in the 90s. So that was kind of my way of getting into this. So it's a very interpersonal, embodied kind of an experience of getting into researching safe spaces online. And being women-only space doesn't make it a safe space, but what is a safe space? And then being what you think a part of a community that comes from the same, sociocultural framework as you doesn't necessarily make you part of that community, or it does. So the complexities of these issues kind of come into play in different ways in all my writing. So that's kind of the sum of how I came here.
Okay. Now, I want to be mindful of time. So we have a few questions that we planned, but 10 minutes to answer them. So we need short answers for this part so we can have a robust conversation with our audience. So a brief answer to each of these. Can you point us or talk about a particular project where you recently were thinking through some of the ideas we've been discussing in relationship to place, feminism, and technology?
Well, back to the issue of performance. How is it when we enter a city or we walk into a building that we change that building as well? And so my projects that are ongoing now in England are also related to the same kinds of issues of how housing estates, or what we would call public housing here, are altered by the people who live there as much as the people who live there are altered by those projects.
And the same question for you, but of course, I think one of the resonances between your work is that in the projects you're describing right now, you are talking about physical space. Mm-hmm. You're talking about quote unquote lived reality or unmediated spaces, buildings, houses, and your work sort of starts or reverberates between purely digital spaces and their sort of blended realities to which they point that are embodied spaces, lived spaces, reality. And so that's a tension or a place of conversation between the two of you. So could you talk about one place that you're doing research right now? And we can look, later we can always go look at your work online.
Sure. I do want to address the tension, though, because what's invisible in the work I do is the years of travel and ethnography I've done in rural India with my collaborators. And currently what I'm working on is craft networks, and that brings together the tactility and materiality of the offline, because unless you're actually doing the craft offline, you can't be part of those networks. And so that's...
So I put some pictures up from your...
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. These things were to basically problematize the notion of who a digital native is. This is a digital native, and the previous ones too were digital natives. And this was where one of my co-authors was saying, and I agree with her. She said, if you're going to bring those pictures up, wouldn't then that reproduce the exoticizing of the other? Because, what people would assume at the sight of that is that it's a juxtaposition of modern and tradition. But the reality is it's not a juxtaposition of the modern and tradition. This is modern. These are digital natives. These people are probably born after 1985. And they don't know how to use grounded line telephones as well as they do mobile phones, right? So that makes them digital natives. So I wanted to put those up, and then of course you have my the Second Life, one of the friends from Second Life who was also a digital native, right? So I wanted to put those up to problematize that notion and bring that up, and the fact that, yes, the materiality in travel is very important. So.
I guess I just maybe for later want to think about tactility. And boy, you know, we're moving back and forth between the word place and space, and I hope we can actually talk about that because I think there's something that you've both thought about. So if I'm using the words incorrectly, you know, I'm acknowledging that may be the case. But how a tactile or lived or material relationship to the things that we make, the space that we inhabit, how we can be together physically is connected to and also different from and presses against the same kinds of experiences we yearn for that we can produce online. And we see this. I touch this here, and then I look at your sari there, and I try and imagine the beautiful relationships between both of those possibilities as placed or tactile or material and immaterial experiences that we have of things that we want and ways to live that we want. So in any case, that's out there for the class later if people want to talk about tactility. So, my friends, one key question for the future.
Well, I think this place of conversation that we've been dancing around of the ways in which there is no longer really an offline and an online, and what Charles S. calls on life, this idea that the digital is a transitional space, but so is geographic place, as we've been talking about, transitional. It's like you can't step in the same river twice, and that I think it's an ongoing question. It's a place of rich discovery, and we can keep exploring how that alters us and we it.
Sure. And one of the things I'm glad you brought up the idea of transitional, because how long are we going to be transitional? Is there a place we land? And are we constantly in transition? And that seems to be the code of today. And the way we talk about it is as if there was a time when it wasn't there. But when you actually think about the binaries and reclaim these concepts and terms, and this is why I was going to say to Alex is like I think we can reclaim the idea of space and place in particular ways and reinsert materiality as happening both online and offline and as a continuum. Having said that, I also think that there are people who are not online, and that's something we forget. And we also know that we also want to say that I think being online is not necessarily better than being not online. So being part of communities that, I mean, of course, there are people not online who do not have the option of being online. And what that does to our world, we won't know until several decades. They might have the upper hand.
In my class, we particularly enjoyed that moment in the dialogue where Kim Sawchuk was talking about her research with elderly Canadians who weren't not going online because they couldn't. They were making an ethical and principled decision to live their lives in a place. And she thought, we can learn from this decision to not necessarily go wired because it's there, not necessarily or absolutely make this choice because it's where we're projected to go and it's the inevitable future. And that can be a principled decision to be here, to be together, to work in our communities, you know, to touch each other and things. Have you heard anything in the previous dialogues, just one moment, one interaction, something that got pointed to that would be interesting to reframe or rethink through our conversation about place, feminism, and technology?
So one of the things that Faith Wilding talked about was the fertility tourism, which is a very place-based, at the same time technological intervention, I guess, of people who are harvesting eggs. And she talked about Carnegie Mellon University, where she was teaching, as being a hot college because of the intellectual caliber of the students. So women were paying their way through college by donating their eggs. And then her work with Sub Rosa in Slovenia, where also people would go there to either find surrogate mothers or egg donors.
Thank you.
I enjoyed all the video dialogues, and I obviously connect a lot to Lisa Nakamura and Maria Fernandez's dialogue, and the connections I think came out even the way we were talking. So, but I'm going to talk about Scavanati's video, which T.L. Coven did, because what that's doing is before we started the video dialogue, we talked about how can we kind of mix it all up in terms of the racism. That's what I got from that, and then one of you said something about attending classes bunnies as you know, other things, and then in Second Life. So sorry. See, this is me. I have no. Well, this is me, right? Second Life is real for me, and there's the seamless boundaries. She got me. I'm so sorry. And this is how I end up sounding inappropriate sometimes. And people are looking at me, what did she just say? And does she know what she said? Yeah. So, Scavanati does this, talks about her work with since the 90s, right? Again, going back to you know, when we were in all these, I think she might have been part of it too. I know Lisa and Maria and several of us were part of these undercurrents list procs, yes. And other list procs where Coco Fusco was there and others. And Scavanati talks about how she kind of moves to the space called cyber powwow and brings together and produces different kinds of machinima to mix these categories up. And for me, when I was watching that video, I do recommend you go back and watch it and think about it in terms of the materiality of being online. We have to disrupt this notion that being online is somehow disembodied and immaterial. It's not immaterial. When a programmer, software worker, coder is working online, he or she is not doing immaterial work. It's not immaterial labor at all. It's a material practice. It's a very, very material coding. In fact, materially codes us when we talk about space and place. So those are I'm not saying that individual programmers have the power to define us, again, going back, but it's a co-construction of coding and materiality.
Thank you all in the room, and thank you all online or in the future when this becomes a QuickTime video. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your ideas with us. Okay, bye-bye.